The rain had been falling on Portland for 3 days straight when I finally brought myself to open the safe deposit box. It was mid-October, exactly 6 weeks after I buried my husband, Gerald. The funeral home had been filled with his colleagues from the architecture firm, neighbors who'd watched our family grow, and distant relatives who appeared like ghosts from our past. But now, in the sterile silence of the bank's private room, it was just me, the metallic click of the key, and the secrets Gerald had left behind. My hands trembled as I pulled out the stack of documents. There was a letter addressed to me in his distinctive architect's handwriting, each letter perfectly formed even as his health had been failing. I pressed it against my chest for a moment, feeling the paper crinkle against my cardigan, before I found the courage to read. The letter explained everything with the methodical precision that had defined Gerald's 42 years of designing buildings. The house on Laurelhurst Avenue, the one he'd inherited from his uncle 3 years ago and never mentioned to anyone. The 2 cars registered in a storage facility in Beaverton. A bank account at a different institution, carefully maintained, with a balance that made my breath catch in my throat. All of it, every single asset, titled solely in my name through a trust he'd established months before his cancer diagnosis. I sat in that small room for over an hour, reading and rereading his words. Gerald had been thorough, explaining his reasoning with the same care he'd used when designing a building's foundation. He'd seen something I hadn't wanted to see, noticed patterns I'd excused as normal family dynamics. His letter didn't accuse anyone directly, but between the lines, I could read his concerns about our son, Dorian, and more pointedly, about Dorian's wife, Cassidy. When I finally emerged from the bank, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets gleaming under the gray afternoon light. I drove home to the modest ranch house Gerald and I had shared for 35 years, the one everyone knew about, the one that held our visible life together. As I pulled into the driveway, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell anyone about the inheritance. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I needed time to think, to grieve, to understand what Gerald had been trying to protect me from. That evening, Dorian called, as he had every evening since the funeral. His voice carried the familiar mix of concern and distraction that had become his default tone over the past decade. "I'm doing okay, sweetheart," I told him, settling into Gerald's recliner, the fabric still holding the shape of his body. "Just sorting through some paperwork. You know how it is. Mom, Cassidy and I were thinking," he began, and I could hear her voice murmuring something in the background. "We should probably sit down and go through Dad's estate. You know, make sure everything is in order. We want to help you navigate all this." My fingers tightened on the phone. "That's very thoughtful, Dorian, but there's really not much to navigate. Your father was very organized. Everything is quite straightforward." There was a pause, and I could almost see him exchanging glances with Cassidy in their expensive condo downtown. "But Mom, we should at least understand what the financial situation looks like. The house, Dad's pension, any savings. Cassidy has a friend who's a financial planner, and she thinks—" "I appreciate the concern," I interrupted gently but firmly, "but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Your father made sure of that." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine. I could see old Mr. Patterson walking his terrier, the Nguyen family's teenagers shooting hoops in their driveway, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing as they always had. But inside this house, inside me, something had shifted. Gerald's letter had planted a seed of doubt that was already beginning to grow. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of my new widow's life. I attended my grief support group at the community center, where 6 other women and 2 men gathered weekly to share our losses. I volunteered at the library's literacy program, helping adults learn to read, finding purpose in their small victories. I maintained my garden, though the autumn meant mostly cleanup and preparation for winter, and I didn't mention the inheritance to anyone. But Dorian's calls became more frequent, Cassidy's voice more often in the background, their questions more pointed. They wanted to know about insurance policies, bank accounts, investment portfolios. Each inquiry was wrapped in concern, dressed up as filial duty, but I could hear something else underneath, something hungry and impatient that Gerald had apparently heard long before I did. Exactly 1 week after I'd opened that safe deposit box, I got the shock that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for late October, and I was having coffee on my back porch when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local, so I answered. Mrs. Merriweather. This is Detective Sarah Brightwell, with the Portland Police Department's Fraud Division. I need to speak with you about some unusual activity we've discovered. Would it be possible for me to come by your home this afternoon? My coffee went cold in my hands as I listened to what she had to say. Someone had been attempting to access Gerald's accounts, using forged power of attorney documents dated before his death. Someone had contacted his former employer, inquiring about death benefits and pension transfers. Someone had even approached our mortgage company, asking about the title to our home and whether it could be refinanced or sold. And all of this, someone's actions traced back to a computer IP address and phone number registered to my own son and his wife. I sat on that porch long after Detective Brightwell hung up, promising to visit at 2 o'clock. The morning sun grew warmer. Neighbors passed by, walking their dogs, calling out greetings I barely registered. I thought about the baby boy I'd brought home from the hospital 39 years ago, the toddler who'd clung to my leg on his first day of preschool, the teenager who'd confided his dreams to me late at night when the rest of the world slept. I thought about the young man who'd introduced me to Cassidy 9 years ago, his eyes shining with what I'd believed was love but now suspected might have been something else entirely. And I thought about Gerald, my steady, observant husband, who'd seen what I hadn't wanted to see and had quietly, methodically protected me in the only way he knew how, by keeping secrets, by creating a safety net I hadn't known I needed. The inheritance wasn't about the money or the property. It was about trust, about belief, about the fundamental assumption that the child you raised would never see you as an obstacle to be overcome or a resource to be exploited. Gerald's letter had tried to prepare me for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare a mother for the knowledge that her own son had been plotting to take what wasn't his, that he'd been counting down the days until his father's death would make me vulnerable. When Detective Brightwell arrived that afternoon, I served her tea in my living room, the same room where Dorian had opened Christmas presents for 3 decades, where we'd celebrated birthdays and graduations and the ordinary milestones of family life. And I told her everything I knew, which wasn't much, but it was enough. The inheritance I'd kept secret for a week had just become the evidence that would break my family apart, and I had no idea if anything would ever be able to put it back together again. Chapter 2. Family Fractures. Detective Sarah Brightwell was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much human weakness. She sat across from me in my living room, her notepad balanced on her knee, as I explained the contents of Gerald's safe deposit box and the inheritance I'd kept quiet. Mrs. Merriweather, she said carefully, setting down her teacup on the coffee table Gerald had built 30 years ago. I need you to understand the seriousness of what we've uncovered. The attempted fraud wasn't just casual inquiry. Someone went to considerable effort to create convincing forgeries, power of attorney documents, financial authorizations, even a forged death certificate with altered dates to expedite insurance claims. My stomach turned. A forged death certificate. While Gerald was still dying, she nodded grimly. The documents were dated 2 weeks before your husband's actual passing. Someone was preparing to take action even before his death was certain. I closed my eyes, remembering those final weeks. Dorian had visited regularly, often alone when Cassidy claimed to be working. He'd helped me with paperwork, or so I'd thought. He'd organized Gerald's files, saying he wanted to make things easier for me when the time came. I'd been grateful, believing my son was being thoughtful during an impossible time. Now I understood he'd been conducting reconnaissance, gathering information, planning his strategy. Do you have any idea why your son might have felt entitled to your husband's assets? Detective Brightwell asked gently. Any conversations about inheritance? Any promises made? I shook my head slowly. Gerald and I never discussed our financial affairs with Dorian in specific terms. We helped him when we could. We paid for his undergraduate degree, gave him money for his wedding, co-signed his first apartment. But we never promised him anything. We expected to be around longer, to enjoy our retirement, maybe help with grandchildren someday. Has he asked about grandchildren? The question seemed odd, but I answered honestly. No, Cassidy's always said they're focused on their careers right now. She works in pharmaceutical sales, makes good money. Dorian's in marketing for a tech startup. They seem comfortable financially, or at least they appear to be. Detective Brightwell made a note. Appearances can be deceiving, Mrs. Merriweather. We've found that financial fraud within families often stems from hidden desperation. People living beyond their means, gambling debts, poor investments. Would you be surprised to learn your son was in financial trouble? I thought about their downtown condo with its floor-to-ceiling windows and views of the Willamette River. Their European vacations documented extensively on social media. Cassidy's designer handbags, Dorian's new car every 2 years. I'd always assumed they were successful. But then again, I'd assumed my son would never try to steal from his grieving mother. The detective's visit lasted 2 hours. She explained that the investigation was in its preliminary stages, that they needed my cooperation to build a case, that I should absolutely not confront Dorian or Cassidy until the police had gathered sufficient evidence. She also strongly recommended I secure all of Gerald's documents, change passwords on any shared accounts, and consider consulting with an attorney. After she left, I sat alone in the gathering dusk, unable to turn on the lights, unable to move from the couch where Gerald and I had spent thousands of evenings together. My phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Dorian. Each one made me flinch. "Mom, just checking in. Haven't heard from you today. Everything okay? Cassidy made that chicken recipe you like. Want us to bring some by. Call me when you get a chance. Want to discuss something important." That last text arrived at 8:15 p.m. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what important thing he wanted to discuss. Whether he'd discovered somehow that the police were investigating. Whether he was planning to accelerate his scheme. Worried that his window of opportunity was closing. I didn't respond. Instead, I called my younger brother, Wesley, who lived in Seattle. Wesley was 5 years my junior, a philosophy professor at the University of Washington, and the person I'd always trusted with my deepest worries. I told him everything, my voice breaking several times as the reality of the situation finally crashed over me. "Delphi," Wesley said, using the childhood nickname only he still used. "I'm so sorry, but you need to protect yourself. This isn't about Dorian being a bad person. People do terrible things when they're desperate or influenced by the wrong people. You have to think about your own security now. He's my son, Wesley, my baby boy, and you're my sister. I watched you raise that kid with everything you had. But sometimes the children we raise become people we don't recognize. You can grieve that loss while still protecting yourself." We talked for over an hour, Wesley's calm logic gradually penetrating my emotional fog. He offered to drive down the next day, to be there when I consulted with an attorney, to help me navigate whatever came next. I accepted gratefully, realizing how isolated I'd become in my grief, how much I'd been leaning on Dorian because he was supposed to be my support system. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house startled me. I kept thinking about the forged documents, the careful planning, the cold calculation required to execute such a scheme against your own mother. Around 3 a.m., I got up and went into Gerald's home office, a small converted bedroom where he'd worked on freelance projects even in retirement. His desk was exactly as he'd left it. Architectural drawings, reference books, a coffee mug I hadn't had the heart to wash. I opened the desk drawers systematically, looking for I didn't know what. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath old project files, I found a manila folder labeled simply DE. Inside were bank statements, printed emails, and a timeline in Gerald's handwriting. My hands shook as I read through the documents. Gerald had been tracking Dorian's finances for over 2 years. He'd noticed the increasing credit card debt, the pattern of large cash withdrawals, the declined transactions. He'd saved emails where Dorian had asked for loans, each request more urgent than the last, each accompanied by promises to pay it back that were never fulfilled. One email, sent just 4 months before Gerald's diagnosis, was particularly devastating. Dorian had written, asking for $50,000 to cover a business opportunity that would set them up for life. Gerald had responded, kindly but firmly, that we couldn't extend that kind of money, that Dorian and Cassidy needed to live within their means, and perhaps consider financial counseling. Dorian's reply had been cold and bitter, accusing his father of not believing in him, of favoring stability over ambition, of being a disappointment as a parent. I sat on the floor of that office, surrounded by evidence of my son's financial desperation and moral deterioration, and wept, not just for Gerald's death, though that pain was still raw and overwhelming, but for the death of the family I'd believed we were, for the loss of the son I thought I'd raised, for the naive trust that had been systematically betrayed. When Wesley arrived the next morning, he found me still in the office, exhausted and hollow. He made coffee, called an attorney his colleague recommended, and sat with me while I tried to make sense of a situation that defied any rational explanation. The attorney, a sharp woman named Miranda Chen, came to the house that afternoon. She reviewed Gerald's inheritance documents, listened to Detective Brightwell's findings, and delivered her assessment with professional directness. "You have an airtight case for fraud," she said. "The question is what you want to achieve. Do you want to pursue criminal charges against your son and daughter-in-law? Do you want to seek a civil settlement? Do you want to simply protect yourself and move forward without confrontation?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what I want except for this not to be happening." Miranda nodded sympathetically. "Take some time to think about it. But while you're thinking, we need to take immediate protective measures. I'll file restraining orders if necessary, alert all financial institutions about the fraud attempts, and ensure your assets are completely secured. Your son and his wife cannot be allowed continued access to your financial information or property." The next few days passed in a blur of legal paperwork, security measures, and painful realizations. Detective Brightwell called twice with updates. The investigation had uncovered more than initially suspected. Cassidy had been the primary architect of the scheme, using her pharmaceutical sales connections to find document forgers. But Dorian had been fully complicit, providing information and access. They'd accumulated over $200,000 in debt, hidden through a complex web of credit cards and personal loans. They'd been counting on Gerald's death to solve their financial crisis. On the 6th day after Detective Brightwell's first visit, Dorian appeared at my door unannounced. It was early evening, the October sky already dark, and I was preparing dinner when I heard his key in the lock. The key I hadn't yet had the strength to ask him to return. He stopped in the doorway when he saw my face. I hadn't called him back in days, hadn't responded to his increasingly frantic texts. I'd been hiding in my own home, protected by Wesley's presence and Miranda's legal barriers, avoiding the confrontation I knew was inevitable. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the question in his voice, the uncertainty. "Is something wrong? Why haven't you been answering? I've been worried sick." I looked at my son, really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time in years. He was 39 years old, but in that moment, he seemed much younger, his face already forming the defensive expression I'd seen countless times throughout his childhood when caught in some minor transgression. The same face, the same evasion, but the stakes were infinitely higher now. "I think you know exactly what's wrong, Dorian," I said quietly, and the fragile pretense of normalcy that had barely survived Gerald's death shattered completely. Chapter 3. Confrontation and Confession. Dorian stood frozen in my doorway, his hand still on the doorknob, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for me to identify. Behind him, I could see Cassidy waiting in their car at the curb, her silhouette visible in the driver's seat, watching the house. Neither of them had expected to find Wesley here, standing protectively in the hallway behind me, or to see the open boxes containing Gerald's files that I'd been systematically reviewing. "Mom, whatever you think is happening," Dorian began, his voice taking on a placating tone I'd heard him use in business calls. I raised my hand to stop him. "The police have been here, Dorian," Detective Brightwell from the Fraud Division. "They've shown me the forged documents, the attempted account access, the false power of attorney papers that were created while your father was still alive, still dying. Do you understand what I'm saying?" His face paled, and for a moment, I saw genuine fear flicker across his features. Then, almost immediately, the defenses went up. I watched his posture shift, his jaw tighten, his eyes darken with something that looked disturbingly like anger. "You went to the police, about your own son, without even talking to me first." The audacity of the question nearly took my breath away. Wesley moved forward slightly, his presence a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had support. I found my voice, steadier than I expected. "You forged legal documents to steal from me, Dorian. You started planning this before your father even died. What exactly did you expect me to do when the police came to me with evidence?" "It wasn't like that," he said quickly, stepping into the house now, closing the door behind him. I could see him calculating, trying to find the right angle. the story that would make this acceptable. Mom, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. Cassidy's company had layoffs, and my startup hasn't paid out yet, and we've got the condo, and so you thought you'd steal your mother's inheritance to cover your bad financial decisions. Wesley interjected, his voice sharp with controlled fury. You couldn't come to her honestly and ask for help. We did ask for help. Dorian shot back, his composure cracking. Dad refused. He said we needed to learn to manage our own money, like we were children who'd overspent our allowances. Do you know how humiliating that was? I felt something cold settle in my chest. So this was revenge? I asked quietly. This was punishment because your father wouldn't enable your overspending. No. God, Mom. Why are you twisting everything? Dorian ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar from his childhood that it hurt to witness. We just needed a bridge loan. We were going to pay it all back. But then Dad got sick, and everything got complicated. And Cassidy thought she could forge documents and commit fraud. Wesley finished. Dorian, do you hear yourself? There's no version of this story where you're the victim. Outside, a car horn honked twice. Cassidy, growing impatient. Dorian glanced toward the sound, then back at me, and I saw something desperate bloom in his expression. Mom, please. If you press charges, I'll go to jail. My career will be destroyed. Cassidy's too. Everything we've built will be gone. Is that what you want? To destroy your own son's life? The manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that I felt the last vestiges of my maternal guilt evaporate. I walked to the couch and sat down, suddenly exhausted by the weight of this conversation, by the death of the illusions I'd been carrying. Tell me the truth, Dorian. All of it. How much debt are you in? How long have you been planning this? And how much of this was Cassidy's idea versus your own? He remained standing, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. For a long moment, I didn't think he would answer. Then, perhaps sensing that honesty was his last possible card to play, he started talking. The debt started about 3 years ago. Cassidy's commissions weren't as high as she'd projected, and I'd invested heavily in the startup based on promises that didn't pan out. We thought we could handle it, but then the condo fees increased, and we'd already committed to the Europe trip for our anniversary. It snowballed. We tried to manage it, but the interest kept compounding, and we had to take out loans to cover credit card payments, and how much? I repeated. $230,000, he whispered, give or take. Wesley whistled low. Jesus, Dorian. I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of their financial irresponsibility. That was more than Gerald and I had spent on our house when we'd bought it, more than we'd spent on anything in our entire marriage, except Dorian's education, which we'd saved for years to afford. And the forgeries. When did that start? After Dad's diagnosis. Cassidy has a client who knows people who do document work. She said it was standard estate planning, that families did it all the time to make transitions easier. She made it sound reasonable. It's fraud, Dorian. It's illegal. It's a felony. But we weren't going to actually steal anything. His voice rose defensively. We were just going to borrow against the inheritance. We were going to pay it back before you ever knew. It was only when the police got involved that everything fell apart. I opened my eyes and looked at my son, really studied him. When had he become this person? Had he always been capable of this kind of rationalization? Or had Cassidy shaped him into it? Or had Gerald and I somehow failed him in ways I couldn't yet identify? The police got involved because you committed crimes, I said softly. Multiple crimes. And you did it while your father was dying, while I was overwhelmed with grief and medical decisions and funeral arrangements. You saw my vulnerability and you exploited it. Mom, please, there's a box in your old bedroom, I continued, my voice steady now, resolved. It has all your childhood things, your baseball trophies, your school projects, your college diplomas. I'd like you to take it tonight, and I'd like your key to this house. You're kicking me out. His voice cracked. I'm your son. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA, I replied, and I was surprised by how calm I felt. My son wouldn't have done this. My son would have come to me honestly if he was in trouble. My son would have valued our relationship more than money. I don't know who you've become, Dorian, but you're not the child I raised. Wesley moved to stand beside me. his hand resting lightly on my shoulder in support. Dorian looked between us, his face cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and finally, a kind of cold acceptance. "Fine," he said flatly. "Give me the box." While Wesley supervised him gathering his childhood belongings, I sat in the living room, listening to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, boxes being carried down the hallway. I thought about the day I'd brought him home from the hospital, how Gerald had cried holding him for the first time. I thought about scraped knees and bedtime stories, and teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway where Cassidy now waited impatiently. When Dorian emerged with 3 boxes stacked in his arms, he paused at the door. "Are you really going to let them prosecute me?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine fear or might have been continued manipulation. I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference. "That's not my decision," I said. "That's up to Detective Brightwell and the district attorney. I've given them the information they need. What they do with it is out of my hands. You could tell them you don't want to press charges. You're the victim. They'd listen to you." I stood up slowly, facing him one last time. "If I do that, what will you have learned? That you can betray the people who love you and face no consequences. That fraud and theft are acceptable when you're desperate. That your mother will always protect you no matter what you do." He had no answer for that. After a long, painful moment, he turned and walked out, loading the boxes into Cassidy's car. I watched through the window as they had what appeared to be a heated argument in the front seat. Then Cassidy drove away, tires squealing slightly, and they were gone. Wesley found me still standing at the window an hour later, staring out at the quiet street. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me. His presence a reminder that family wasn't only about blood, that sometimes the people who supported you most were the ones who'd known you longest, who remembered who you were before loss and betrayal reshaped your understanding of the world. "What are you thinking?" he finally asked. "I'm thinking about a conversation Gerald and I had about 5 years ago. Dorian had just gotten engaged to Cassidy, and we were discussing wedding gifts. Gerald said something that seemed odd at the time. He said, 'We need to think about protecting ourselves as we get older. People can change, even people we love.' I thought he was being paranoid. I wish I'd listened. Gerald was always perceptive," Wesley said gently. "He saw patterns you didn't want to see." I turned away from the window, facing my brother. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing? Letting the investigation proceed? Miranda says I could request they drop the charges, that sometimes families handle these things privately." Wesley considered this carefully. "If you protect him from the consequences of this, what does that teach him? More importantly, what does it teach Cassidy? They've accumulated massive debt through poor choices, and their solution was to commit fraud against a grieving widow. That's not desperation, Delphi. That's moral bankruptcy. If there are no consequences, they'll just find another victim, make other bad choices. He's still my son, and you're still his mother. But being a mother doesn't mean sacrificing your own security and dignity to protect an adult child from his own actions." Gerald understood that. That's why he structured the inheritance the way he did. He was protecting you, even after his death. The next morning, Detective Brightwell called with an update. Based on the evidence, the district attorney was moving forward with charges. Dorian and Cassidy would be formally charged within the week. There would be an arraignment, possible plea negotiations, and potentially a trial. I would need to testify, to tell my story in front of judges and lawyers and the curious public. "How do you feel about that?" Detective Brightwell asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me hopes they'll accept a plea bargain, pay restitution, and get probation. Part of me thinks they need to face the full consequences of what they did. And part of me just wants to disappear somewhere quiet and pretend none of this ever happened." "That's a completely normal reaction," she assured me. "Family fraud cases are always the hardest. But Mrs. Merriweather, I want you to know that what you're doing takes real courage. Most victims in these situations protect their family members out of guilt or obligation. By standing up for yourself, you're sending a message that this behavior is unacceptable." After we hung up, I went to Gerald's office and sat at his desk. I pulled out the letter he'd left me, reading it again with new understanding. In the final paragraph, he'd written, "Delphine, my love, if you're reading this after discovering what I've arranged, it means I was right to worry. I'm sorry for keeping secrets, but I couldn't leave you vulnerable. You've spent our entire marriage taking care of everyone else. Me, Dorian, your students, the neighbors, anyone who needed help. It's time someone took care of you, even if that someone is me from beyond the grave. Be strong, be wise, and remember that loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt you. I'll always be with you, in every beam of sunlight, every Portland rain, every quiet moment when you think you're alone. You never are. I love you always. Gerald. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the desk drawer. Then I pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began writing my own letter, documenting everything that had happened, everything I'd learned, everything I felt. I wrote about betrayal and grief, about the death of illusions and the unexpected strength that comes from facing painful truths. I wrote until my hand cramped and the afternoon light faded to evening. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Dorian would ever truly understand what he'd done, if our relationship could ever be repaired, if I would ever trust him again. But I knew I would survive this. Gerald had made sure of that, and Wesley's presence reminded me that I still had family worth cherishing. The inheritance I'd kept secret had become the catalyst for the hardest choice of my life. But in choosing my own dignity over maternal guilt, in refusing to be a victim of my own child's greed, I was honoring everything Gerald and I had built together. Our marriage had been based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine partnership. I wouldn't betray those values now, even if standing by them meant standing alone against my own son. The rain started again that night. Typical Portland weather, washing the streets clean and making everything glisten in the streetlights. I stood at the kitchen window, watching water stream down the glass, and felt something inside me begin to shift. Not healing yet. That would take much longer. But perhaps the first stirring of acceptance, the beginning of understanding that some losses are necessary, that some chapters must end before new ones can begin. Chapter 4. Legal Proceedings. The Pierce County Courthouse was a brutalist concrete structure that had always reminded me of Gerald's early architectural work, functional but imposing, designed to convey authority rather than comfort. I sat in the gallery with Wesley on one side and Miranda Chen on the other, waiting for Dorian and Cassidy's arraignment to begin. It was a cold November morning, 2 months after Gerald's death, and the courtroom's fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unforgiving. I'd dressed carefully that morning, choosing one of Gerald's favorite dresses, a deep blue that he'd always said brought out my eyes. It felt important to look composed, to present myself as someone who'd made a deliberate choice, rather than a confused elderly woman being manipulated by outsiders. The local news had picked up the story. Local widow's son, charged with inheritance fraud. And there were reporters in the hallway, though Miranda had assured me I didn't need to speak to any of them. When Dorian and Cassidy entered with their attorney, I felt Wesley's hand grip mine. Dorian looked haggard, his suit rumpled, his hair uncombed. Cassidy, by contrast, was immaculately dressed, her expression one of carefully crafted innocence. She glanced toward the gallery, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating flash across her face before she looked away. The arraignment itself was brief and procedural. The charges were read: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, attempted identity theft, and several other counts that made my stomach turn. Each charge carried potential prison time. The defense attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, entered not guilty pleas and requested bail. The prosecutor, a young woman named Jennifer Park, argued for significant bail amounts given the defendants demonstrated sophistication in financial crimes. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, set bail at $100,000 each. Dorian's face crumpled when he heard the amount. Cassidy whispered urgently to their attorney. From what I could overhear, they didn't have access to that kind of money. Their assets were frozen as part of the investigation, and their families either couldn't or wouldn't help. They'd have to remain in custody until trial. As they were led away, Dorian looked back at me one more time. His expression was a complicated mix of pleading and resentment, hope and anger. I held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the absolution he was seeking. Then he was gone, and the courtroom was emptying, and Miranda was explaining what would happen next. The trial was set for early February, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. In the meantime, Detective Brightwell's team continued their investigation, uncovering more evidence of the scheme's extent. They'd found emails between Cassidy and the document forger, text messages between her and Dorian discussing how to time the fraud, and financial records showing they'd been researching Gerald's assets for over a year. What hurt most was discovering how long the planning had taken. This wasn't a desperate act born of sudden crisis. It was a calculated, long-term strategy. They'd been looking at me as a mark, an asset to be exploited, since well before Gerald's cancer diagnosis. Thanksgiving came and went. I spent it with Wesley and his partner, David, in Seattle. We didn't talk much about the case, focusing instead on memories of happier holidays, on gratitude for the family bonds that had survived. But when David asked me to share what I was thankful for, I found myself saying, for Gerald's wisdom, for seeing clearly what I couldn't see, for loving me enough to protect me even after he was gone. December brought the preliminary hearings. I had to testify about Gerald's estate, about the inheritance documents, about my interactions with Dorian and Cassidy in the weeks following Gerald's death. Jennifer Park, the prosecutor, was gentle but thorough, walking me through the timeline, establishing my ignorance of the fraud until Detective Brightwell's visit. The defense attorney cross-examined me aggressively, suggesting I'd always planned to cut Dorian out of the inheritance, that Gerald's secretive estate planning proved we didn't trust our son, that I was using the legal system to punish Dorian for disappointments that had nothing to do with fraud. I answered each question calmly, sticking to the facts, refusing to be baited into emotional responses. "Did you love your son, Mrs. Merriweather?" the defense attorney asked. "I love the child I raised," I answered. "I'm not sure I know the man he's become." That response made the evening news. Public opinion was divided. Some people saw me as a strong woman refusing to be victimized. Others saw me as a cruel mother punishing her son for financial mistakes. The comment sections of news articles were vicious, strangers projecting their own family dynamics onto my situation, judging me based on incomplete information and their own biases. Miranda advised me to stop reading the coverage. Nothing good comes from seeing what people say when they think they understand your life based on a 300-word article, she said. Focus on what you know is true. Focus on taking care of yourself. I tried to follow her advice, but the isolation was difficult. Most of my friends were uncomfortable discussing the situation. Some sided with me immediately. Others disappeared, either judging me silently or simply not knowing what to say. My grief support group became my refuge, a place where I could talk about the multiple losses I was experiencing. Gerald, Dorian, my understanding of my own family, my trust in my own judgment. One evening in mid-December, I received an unexpected visit from Cassidy's mother, Margaret. She was a small, tired-looking woman in her early 60s, and she stood on my porch with her hands twisting nervously around the handle of her purse. "Mrs. Merriweather, I'm so sorry to come uninvited," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to say, I wanted you to know that I don't condone what Cassidy and Dorian did. What they tried to do to you. It was wrong. It was terrible." I invited her in, made tea, and we sat in my living room while she explained. Margaret had only recently learned the full extent of Cassidy's involvement in the fraud. Her daughter had told her a sanitized version, painting herself as a victim of Dorian's schemes. But the evidence presented in the preliminary hearings had revealed the truth. Cassidy had been the architect, the planner, the one who'd researched and coordinated every aspect of the crime. "I never raised her to be like this," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know where I went wrong. I don't know how she became someone who could do this to another person, especially to her husband's mother." I understood her pain deeply. We were both mothers confronting the reality that the children we'd raised had become people capable of cruelty we couldn't have imagined. We talked for hours, sharing our bewilderment and grief, finding unexpected comfort in each other's company. Before she left, Margaret hugged me tightly. "I can't testify against my daughter," she said. "I hope you understand. But I wanted you to know that I think you're doing the right thing. Someone has to teach them that actions have consequences." After she left, I sat alone with my tea growing cold, thinking about consequences and responsibility. The trial was approaching, and I knew it would be brutal, but I also knew I couldn't back down now. Too much had been revealed, too many betrayals documented, too much damage done. Christmas was quiet. Wesley came to stay for a week, and we created new traditions, decorating a smaller tree than Gerald and I had always used, cooking simpler meals, acknowledging that this holiday marked the beginning of a new chapter, rather than a continuation of old patterns. On Christmas Eve, we drove to the cemetery and visited Gerald's grave. I'd brought his favorite scotch and 2 glasses. "I'm doing what you said," I told his headstone, pouring scotch into both glasses and leaving one at the base of the marker. "I'm being strong. I'm being wise. And I'm remembering that loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt me. It's harder than I thought it would be, but I'm managing." Wesley stood a respectful distance away, giving me privacy. The cemetery was peaceful, covered in a light dusting of snow that had fallen the night before. Other families visited nearby graves, their quiet conversations and soft tears creating a symphony of shared grief and remembrance. "I miss you," I whispered. "Every day. Every moment. But you were right about needing to protect myself. You saw what I didn't want to see. Thank you for that. Thank you for loving me enough to plan for my security, even when it meant keeping secrets. I wish you were here to help me through this, but I understand why you had to do things this way." The trial began on February 3rd. The courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and court sketch artists. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched as the prosecution systematically laid out the evidence: forged documents, intercepted communications, financial records, and testimony from bank employees, document examiners, and investigators. I testified for an entire day, answering questions about Gerald's estate planning, about discovering the fraud, about my relationship with Dorian and Cassidy. The defense tried to paint me as a controlling mother who'd poisoned Gerald against his son, but the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Gerald's own words, preserved in emails and notes, showed he'd made his decisions independently, based on patterns he'd observed over years. The hardest moment came when they played a recorded phone call between Cassidy and the document forger, discussing specific details of how to forge my signature on various forms. Hearing the casual, business-like tone in which they discussed defrauding me, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome, was devastating. I had to excuse myself from the courtroom, spending 15 minutes in the women's bathroom, fighting to regain my composure. Dorian testified in his own defense, claiming he'd been manipulated by Cassidy, that he hadn't understood the full extent of what they were doing, that he'd thought it was all somehow legal or at least a gray area. His testimony was weak and contradictory, undermined by his own emails showing full awareness and active participation. Cassidy didn't testify. Her attorney advised against it, likely knowing that her communications revealed too much calculation, too much cold planning to be explained away. Instead, they relied on character witnesses who testified about her work ethic, her community involvement, her charitable donations, all funded, the prosecution noted, by debt they'd intended to pay off with my inheritance. The jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those days in Wesley's guest room in Seattle, unable to bear waiting in Portland, unable to face the possibility of running into Dorian or Cassidy or any of their supporters. When the call finally came, I was in David's garden, helping him prepare beds for spring planting. The mundane activity had been soothing, grounding me in simple tasks while the jury decided my son's fate. "They've reached a verdict," Miranda said. "Can you come back today? The judge wants to announce it tomorrow morning." The courtroom was silent as the jury forewoman stood. I sat in the front row, Wesley beside me, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. Dorian and Cassidy sat at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn. On all counts, guilty. 3. Chapter 5. Sentencing and Aftermath. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict. February in Portland was gray and cold, the rain constant and draining. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my sleep disrupted by dreams of Dorian as a child, his small hand reaching for mine in the grocery store, his voice calling, "Mommy, watch this," before jumping off the swing. The present and the past kept colliding in my mind, making it difficult to reconcile the innocent boy in my memories with the man who'd conspired to steal from me. The courtroom felt different on sentencing day. The trial's theatrical elements were gone, replaced by a somber finality. Judge Patricia Morrison sat behind her bench with an expression that suggested she'd spent considerable time contemplating the appropriate consequences for the crime and the criminals before her. Before sentencing, both Dorian and Cassidy had the opportunity to speak. Cassidy went first, her statement clearly crafted by her attorney, expressions of remorse that felt rehearsed. claims of financial desperation that rang hollow, and an apology to me that never quite made eye contact. She cried elegantly, her tears falling at dramatically appropriate moments, and I found myself unmoved by the performance. Then it was Dorian's turn. He stood slowly, gripping the table edge, and for a long moment, he simply looked at me. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to make this easier for him. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking immediately. "I don't even know where to start. I've destroyed everything. My relationship with you, my family, my career, my future, and for what? For money I didn't earn, to pay for a lifestyle I couldn't afford, to impress people who don't matter." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. His attorney moved as if to hand him a tissue, but Dorian waved him away. I told myself we were just borrowing against my inheritance. I told myself Dad was being unreasonable, that we deserved help, that we'd earned it somehow. But the truth is, I knew what we were doing was wrong. Every step of the way, I knew, and I did it anyway. I chose money over you. I chose my pride over your security. I chose to betray the woman who gave me everything. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve to ask for it. But I need you to know that I understand now what I destroyed. Not just legally, but morally. You and Dad taught me right from wrong. You taught me about integrity and honesty, and I spat on those lessons. I became exactly the kind of person you raised me not to be." He sat down abruptly, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I felt wetness on my cheeks and realized I was crying too, not from sympathy, but from grief for the relationship that could never be recovered, for the son who'd existed before greed and bad judgment had transformed him into someone I didn't recognize. Judge Morrison let the silence stretch for several moments before she spoke. Her voice was measured but firm, carrying the weight of her years on the bench and the difficult decisions she'd made. "This case represents a particularly troubling variant of financial elder abuse," she began. "The victims of such crimes are often hesitant to report or testify against family members, which allows the perpetrators to escape consequences and continue their predatory behavior. Mrs. Merriweather's courage in standing up for herself, in refusing to be complicit in her own victimization, should be commended. She reviewed the evidence, the aggravating factors, and the sentencing guidelines. Then she pronounced judgment. Cassidy received 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution. Dorian received 3 years, acknowledging his lesser role in planning the scheme but emphasizing his full participation and breach of familial trust. Both defendants showed visible shock at the sentences. 4 years, 3 years, their prime earning years, their freedom, their future prospects, all sacrificed for a scheme that had failed spectacularly. As the marshals led them away, Dorian looked back at me one last time. I couldn't read his expression. Regret, resentment, resignation, perhaps all three, tangled together in a knot of consequences he'd never anticipated. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Miranda handled most of the questions, her professional demeanor creating a barrier between me and the media's hunger for a tearful statement. But one reporter pushed through, microphone extended, asking the question everyone seemed to want answered. "Mrs. Merriweather, do you regret pursuing charges against your son?" I stopped. Despite Miranda's gentle attempt to keep me moving, I looked directly into the camera, at the red recording light, at all the strangers who'd been judging my choices from the safety of their intact families. "I regret that my son committed crimes that required prosecution," I said clearly. "I regret that he chose to betray the trust his father and I placed in him. I regret that greed and poor judgment led him to treat his grieving mother as an obstacle rather than a person. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret refusing to be a victim. And I don't regret teaching him, even at this late stage, that actions have consequences." The statement made national news. I became, briefly, the face of elder abuse prevention, the symbol of refusing to be victimized by family members. Advocacy groups reached out, asking me to speak at conferences. Financial institutions wanted to feature my story in their fraud prevention materials, but I declined these opportunities. This wasn't a platform I wanted. It was simply a painful chapter I needed to survive. The weeks after sentencing were strange and empty. I'd spent months focused on the investigation, the trial, the legal proceedings. Now, with that structure removed, I was left with the hollowness underneath. Gerald was still gone. Dorian was in prison. My understanding of my own family history had been fundamentally rewritten. I existed in a kind of limbo, neither moving forward nor able to return to the past. Wesley suggested therapy, connecting me with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and grief. Dr. Sarah Yoon was a gentle woman in her 50s, Korean-American, with a direct way of speaking that I found refreshing after months of legal and social niceties. "You're grieving multiple losses simultaneously," she explained during our first session. "You're grieving your husband, obviously. But you're also grieving the son you thought you had, the family structure you believed in, and your own judgment. That last one is often the hardest for people to process." How could I not have seen it? I asked her, the question I'd been asking myself for months. How could I not have noticed what Gerald saw? How could I be so blind to my own son's character? Dr. Yoon leaned forward slightly. "Parents are often the last to see their children's flaws because you're viewing them through layers of love, history, and hope. You don't see them as they are in any given moment. You see them as the accumulation of every moment you've shared. That's not a weakness. That's the nature of parental love. But it does create vulnerabilities that people like Dorian and Cassidy can exploit." Over the next several months, I began the difficult work of rebuilding my understanding of my own life. Dr. Yoon helped me see patterns I'd missed. How Dorian had always been a bit entitled. How he'd learned to manipulate situations to his advantage. How Gerald and I had inadvertently reinforced these traits by making things too easy for him. We'd loved him so much that we'd protected him from the natural consequences of his choices, teaching him that someone would always bail him out, solve his problems, cushion his falls. That's not the same as being responsible for his crimes, Dr. Yoon emphasized. He made adult choices. He committed deliberate acts. But understanding the patterns can help you forgive yourself for not seeing what was coming. Spring came slowly to Portland. I spent more time in my garden, replanting, reorganizing, creating something new rather than just maintaining what Gerald and I had built together. Wesley visited regularly, and I made new friends through my volunteer work at the library and a neighborhood book club. Life acquired a new rhythm, quieter than before, but with its own satisfactions. In May, I received a letter from Dorian. The prison return address made my hands shake as I held it. For several days, I left it unopened on the kitchen table, walking past it multiple times a day, not sure if I wanted to read his words or if I had the strength to engage with whatever he had to say. Finally, on a Sunday morning with rain pattering against the windows, I made coffee, sat at the table, and opened the envelope. The letter was written in Dorian's distinctive handwriting, careful and controlled, the same penmanship he'd developed in elementary school when Gerald had insisted he learn cursive. The letter began with more apologies, more expressions of regret. But then it shifted into something more substantive. Dorian described the prison therapy program he'd been required to attend, how it had forced him to examine his relationship with money, success, and self-worth. He wrote about conversations with his cellmate, a 50-year-old man serving time for embezzlement, who'd asked him a question that haunted him. "What were you really trying to steal? Because it wasn't just money. I've been thinking about that," Dorian wrote. What was I really trying to steal? I think I was trying to steal the feeling of success, of being someone important, of mattering. Cassidy and I built this image of ourselves as successful young professionals, but it was all facade. We were drowning in debt, pretending to be people we weren't, performing success rather than earning it. And when that performance started to collapse, we looked for an easy solution. We looked at you, at Dad's careful planning, his legitimate success, his actual achievements, and we tried to steal that too. The letter continued for several pages, delving into his relationship with Cassidy, which had deteriorated rapidly after sentencing. They blamed each other. Their attorneys had advised them to minimize contact, and whatever emotional bond had once connected them had been severed by the shared experience of their crime and punishment. He ended with a request I hadn't expected. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mom. I don't deserve it, and I wouldn't believe you if you offered it right now. But someday, maybe years from now, when I've served my time and proven through actions rather than words that I've changed, I hope we might talk. Not as we were, because that relationship is gone, but maybe as something new. Two people who shared a history and are trying to build something honest from the ruins." I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation, for the familiar patterns of Dorian's attempts to manage situations to his advantage. But the letter felt different, rawer, more genuine, stripped of the defensiveness that had characterized his trial testimony. Perhaps prison was forcing a kind of honesty that freedom had allowed him to avoid. I didn't respond immediately. Dr. Yoon and I discussed the letter in detail, examining my reactions, my hopes, my fears. She cautioned me against rushing to reconciliation, reminding me that true change takes years, not months, and that I needed to protect myself even as I navigated the possibility of future relationship. "You're allowed to take your time," she said. "You're allowed to wait and see if his actions match his words. You're allowed to maintain boundaries, and you're allowed to eventually forgive him, not to excuse what he did, but to release yourself from carrying the weight of his betrayal." Summer brought new developments. Margaret, Cassidy's mother, and I had maintained sporadic contact. She was divorcing Cassidy's father, finally ending a marriage that had been unhappy for decades. She told me that prosecuting Cassidy had given her the courage to face her own life's compromises, to stop accepting unacceptable situations because they were familiar. "You showed me that standing up for yourself isn't cruel," she said over coffee in my kitchen. "It's necessary. It's survival. I spent my whole marriage being a victim, and I didn't even realize it until I watched you refuse to be one." We became unexpected friends, two mothers navigating the complicated grief of having children who disappointed us profoundly. Neither of us had heard from Cassidy, who blamed us both for her conviction, but we supported each other through the difficult work of rebuilding our lives around the gaps our daughters and sons had left. In August, I made a decision about the inheritance that had caused all this trouble. I established a foundation in Gerald's name, focused on financial literacy education for young adults. The 2 cars were sold, the proceeds added to the foundation. The Laurelhurst house was converted into a community center offering free financial counseling, budgeting workshops, and debt management programs. The bank account funded scholarships for students studying personal finance and nonprofit management. I kept enough to ensure my security, but the rest went toward preventing other families from experiencing what mine had endured. If Dorian and Cassidy's ignorance and poor choices had stemmed from lack of financial education, perhaps I could help others avoid similar mistakes. The foundation's launch received local media coverage. A reporter asked me if I was doing this because I felt guilty about Dorian's conviction. I thought carefully before answering. "I'm doing this because Gerald spent his life building things. Buildings, family, security, legacy. I want to honor that by building something that might prevent other young people from making the devastating choices my son made. It's not about guilt. It's about purpose. It's about creating something meaningful from something painful." As autumn returned to Portland, bringing the familiar rain and cooling temperatures, I found myself in an unexpected place emotionally. I wasn't happy. The losses were too profound for happiness. But I was stable. I was purposeful. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, rather than what they could take from me. And I was learning to distinguish between the grief that needed to be felt and the guilt that needed to be released. One evening in October, exactly a year after I'd opened Gerald's safe deposit box and discovered the inheritance, I returned to the bank. I closed the safe deposit box, no longer needing to hide documents from people who might steal them. I transferred accounts, simplified my financial life, and symbolically ended the chapter that had begun with Gerald's death and led me through betrayal, prosecution, and painful growth. Walking out of the bank into the October rain, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure. That was too neat a concept for the messy reality of ongoing grief and complicated loss. But perhaps acceptance. Perhaps the beginning of understanding that I'd survived something that had broken me open but hadn't broken me apart. I thought about Dorian in prison, hopefully doing the real work of change rather than just serving time. I thought about Cassidy, hopefully facing her own reckoning with the choices that had brought her there. I thought about Margaret, rebuilding her life with hard-won courage. And I thought about Gerald, whose love had been wise enough to protect me even from our own son. The inheritance I'd kept secret had cost me my family as I'd known it, but it had also revealed truths I needed to see, taught me lessons I needed to learn, and ultimately given me the resources to build a life defined by my own choices rather than by others, expectations or manipulations. The rain fell steadily as I drove home through familiar streets, past the houses where neighbors lived their ordinary lives, their own complicated stories hidden behind lit windows and closed doors. I was one of them now, just another person carrying invisible burdens, surviving losses, finding small moments of peace amid the ongoing challenge of living, and that, I realized, was enough.